Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that makes you reach for the popcorn while we take a look at PopCon. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm better now that I've written that joke and you've delivered it incredibly well with exactly the intonation that I was looking for. So thank you very much for that.
Some very helpful hyphens there to ensure I got the intonation down. Yeah. So I guess we're not really. I mean, there has been a lot of news. Don't get me wrong, but I think we're kind of rounding up on stuff here as like we go through these stories. We'll kind of touch on the main things that have been happening. There's been a lot of stories that I feel have been a kind of flash in the pan. I think that's often true in the new year, where something will get mentioned and like 2 days later no one remembers it. But there are some stories that have got some sticking power. So what is PopCon?
It's the new fun faction. Aren't you ready for more factions of the Conservative Party? I know I am. There have been a lot of new ones that I've kind of realised that are cropping up all over the place. There was like the New Conservatives. I think we touched on those in a previous episode. They were from the Red Wall. They were the Conservatives who voted under Boris Johnson. They say we're not like those old nasty Conservatives. We're the new Conservatives for a working class. We've had sort of like the old classics. We've had like the ERG, the European Research Group, sort of bashing on about Brexit a long while after it's done. But PopCon is the brand new spanking faction in town, and its leader, you might have heard of her before. She had a little one-hit wonder last year, went to the top of the charts for 40 days, and then straight back down to the bottom, never to be heard of again. It's Liz Truss. So, from that, I think you can maybe kind of gauge how popular they are, because I think when you first hear the name, the obvious joke is, well, that's a bit of an oxymoron, isn't it? But they are trying something a little bit different here.
Yeah, I think I've just I've reshared with you a picture I saw at the time of one of the headlines, which was Liz Truss offering lessons on how to be popular, which I think was particularly funny because when you clicked into the article, it was like Liz Truss, comma, according to this poll, least popular prime minister ever kind of thing, is now starting a group called the Popular Conservatives, and it's kind of like I kind of see where you're trying to go with this, but also if you just keep saying it, it doesn't make it happen, which I think was kind of her strategy before. But I guess we're going to go through this a bit because we've got a load of points here of the kind of stuff they're talking about, the stuff they're trying to make headlines out of. But I think this is kind of the Conservative Party trying to find its direct. Like we've talked again about how they're doing in the polls, and it's very likely we'll have a Labour government when we get our general election, which we still don't know when that's going to be, holding out on those predictions we made. But it'll be it's kind of like they're trying to find a new what is their message going to be, so they can try and build up to being elected again. But the problem is that right now, the Conservatives are definitely not popular.
Yeah, and that's it. But this splinter group is kind of weird in a sense, and I've listed there. I've got like who are the MPs involved and how popular are they. You've got some of your old favourites. Lee Anderson, the former Deputy Conservative Party chair before he was removed, he's got 11% of the public's support. Jacob Rees-Mogg is also there, GB News correspondent, and occasionally my MP, standing there at 19% popularity, and Liz Truss on 10% popularity. That's all from YouGov polls that sort of ranks all of the Conservative politicians in order of how popular they are amongst the general public. I think you can probably guess who the number one popular Conservative still is, but can you tell me who the number two is on the Conservative list? That's my question for you. So who do you think's number one?
I mean, I assume Boris Johnson is still number one, because you still see people on Vox Pop saying, "Oh, I wish we had Boris back," and you're like, "Why?" So I'm guessing it's Boris at number one, because there is this group of people who like him regardless of his faults.
It is Boris Johnson. Yes, he's got 98% recognise. He's 98% of the public recognise who he is. 29% of them think he's popular. The next person, 84% of the public know who he is, and 29% of people like him. So he is as popular as Boris Johnson. Who could it be?
I'm expecting it's something which will make me go, "Oh, really?" And therefore, I'm going to say Michael Gove.
Ooh,
Because
no, I think we're.
I was just going to say he's been in the public eye enough, but like, yeah, I mean, 29% isn't that many people still. But yeah, okay, that sounded like it was wrong anyway.
It's still not. No, Michael Gove is 38th, I'm afraid, on 13%. He's at the same level as Kwasi Kwarteng.
Oh dear.
And is is below Matt Hancock at 15%. He's the 28th most popular Conservative politician. James Cleverly is on 17%. Nadine Dorries 18% at number 19. Suella Braverman at 15th with 20% popularity. The second most popular Conservative politician according to YouGov is William Hague.
Oh, I kind of wait. Is he still an MP?
He's not still an MP.
Okay, so
no,
it was just Conservative figure. Okay,
yes, just
fair
Conservative
enough.
Politician. Maybe that would have put you off. Yeah, the second most Conservative, the most popular Conservative MP is Rishi Sunak on 25%.
Right. Okay.
Which would suggest out of the choices that they have, they've got the second best option. Not to say that Rishi Sunak couldn't appoint William Hague as a Lord and then make him Prime Minister or something, because he did the same with David. he's done some pretty wacky things recently. But yeah, I wasn't expecting William Hague. If only the secret to success that nobody on the right of politics is talking about. The Daily Mail is not calling for the return of William Hague when really they should be asking him to lead the party again. So.
I mean, I think like when you stop to think about it, I can understand the idea. Like, he was never in power, so he never messed up enough to be like, he was in opposition, right? So he never went and screwed everything up so that you can tar him with that brush. And also, there'll be a level of nostalgia for when politics was more reasonable and these kind of things that people say. I can kind of understand it, but like at that point, I guess John Major must be doing okay up there as well, except for the fact he lost an election. So, but we've talked about that again, when suddenly like old prime ministers come back and you're like, oh yeah, I remember when things were kind of normal. Wouldn't that be nice? Even though no, they probably shouldn't come back. But yeah, it does get discussed.
Yeah, sorry, that little distraction aside. So like again, we're talking about the notion of popular conservatism in bunny ears as I'm doing it. But the odd thing is that you're looking at that list of Conservative politicians, and not that YouGov is the be all and end all, but it's a fairly good sort of like director towards the fact that there's not many, the Conservatives aren't popular within the polls, and even individually, you don't get many standout figures. So the fact that you've got these three sort of points towards they're not popular amongst the general public, but they think they might be popular amongst the grassroots or amongst certain sets of Conservatives. And they were there to sort of relaunch this. They were very adamant as well when they did it that they didn't want to attack Rishi Sunak. I don't think Rishi Sunak's name was mentioned there at all. So this isn't a faction within the party looking to oust him. This isn't plotters that you might have heard about in the news. And some MPs have recently talked openly about them wanting to get rid of Rishi Sunak. I believe one of the speakers who was meant to speak at the event, that was Simon Clarke, he was removed because he had specifically said publicly that he wanted Rishi Sunak to go, and that didn't go with the values of popular conservatism. So these three got together to have a little chat in an odd room in the side of London, and they had a go at a lot of people. So Lee Anderson had a go at net zero targets, COP28 in particular. He kind of said that, when I talk to the working man on the street, they see, COP28 as a bunch of elitists and celebrities using private planes to go over and talk about climate change and decide what they're going to stop the poor people from doing so they can reduce their emissions. So he sees it as a very sort of like two-tiered system when you come to trying to reduce global CO2. Jacob Rees-Mogg had a go at Davos Man. He also criticised
the least popular superhero.
Yes. Yep. There's a quite bizarre attack on Davos there. He also talked about pompous politicians sort of proliferated their profiteroles all over us, or something to that effect. He did an alliteration of P words, which made a lot of people suddenly go, "Excuse me, Jacob, have you looked in the mirror recently?" It was pompous politicians he was talking about, and off the top of my head, I can't think of one more pompous than the top hat wearing Jacob Rees-Mogg. But still, this is conservatism. There's sort of less of a degree of self-reflection there. And then the star attraction, of course, was Liz Truss, who doesn't do many public appearances anymore. She's been quite an odd figure when it comes to what PMs do once they're out of office. The common wisdom is that you have your time in office, you do what you can, you reach the end of your political career, and then you're meant to fade gracefully into the background, only maybe popping up a decade later when you think things have gone slightly off track, or if you want to say something about the current government. But of course, Liz Truss is an anomaly in which she only got 40 odd days to try and put forward her vision before it was taken away from her. And we've talked about her on the past in this podcast, how she's sort of come out with the odd article in the Telegraph here or there, kind of saying, I'm sorry, but it wasn't really my fault. And I feel that was the vibe of her speech that she delivered. She had a go at quangos for existing, for trying to direct public policy. She talked about the civil service and how that's sort of an anchor on her ambitions as Prime Minister. They're the ones who stopped her doing things. That's the reason they can't be more radical or more progressive in their conservatism. They can't do the popular things because people like quangos, university civil servants are all holding them back. There was a bizarre attack where she was talking about universities pushing the LGBT agenda, which, although that's quite like an anti-woke talking point, it's not something you'd expect a former Prime Minister to go on about it. And I, for one, I don't know if you saw any of her speech, but she's quite bullish in how she presents herself. But the other odd thing about it is that for all the MPs and all the people who were there, Liz Truss was the one that seemed to be not only like protected by her security team the most. I think you do get a level of security as a former PM that's sort of up above your average MP status. But she didn't engage with anybody in the media, not anybody like against her, not on her side. She was there to say a piece, and then she was there to go away. So I think for me there is a sort of question, and I think it was reiterated by her time in office, that she wasn't the best at defending her point when she was up against people who disagreed with it, which is maybe where part of this idea of popular conservatism falls down. But that's the general theme and things that were going on. Can you, or anybody in our audience, you kind of you can't write in, but you can play along at home if you want.
We have got ways of contacting us. It's always good to plug. You can comment on the YouTube videos. You can send something to the website.
Yes, no, don't, and please do get in contact with us. But what I'm saying is, I'm about to give you the answer in 30 seconds. So you might not want to put too much time and thought in it. Do you know any link, any common theme you can see behind all these sort of things that they are attacking?
I know you say you're going to answer this in 30 seconds, but this kind of came up in a chat with some friends, and they're like, what is a quango? And then we explained it. It's quasi non-governmental organizations, right? It's what it stands for, and they've kind of made that into a sayable phrase. So quango. But that's that's all these kind of very useful bodies we have, like the Financial Standards Authority and things like that. And then if you look at the other things on the list, Davos is an event. COP28 is like a agreement between multiple countries to come together and have an event. So these are essentially institutions that they've taken umbrage with for whatever reason.
Yeah, they're all institutions that basically, they don't necessarily have like hard power. They have soft power in a sense. So when I'm talking about the difference between hard and soft, hard power is what the Conservatives have had for the past 12 years, right? They have ultimately had their hands on the levers of government that they can put forward ideas and policies and try to put them into motion. And then places like COP28, Davos, quangos, civil servants have softer power. They can't say yes or no decisively, but they can heavily influence. They can say, look at our data. It suggests that if you did this, it would be bad, or public opinion would be against this. Or if you ignore this, then CO2 levels are going to go up, sea levels are going to rise, etc. There's consequences to your actions, and we are the, to borrow the term from Michael Gove, experts that that are trying to tell you no. And Michael Gove's opinion on experts was, of course, like, people have had enough of experts. The bizarre thing about this group, and that sort of difference between hard and soft power highlights it in a way, is that what the Conservatives are trying to tell you is that we know we've been in power for 12 years, but we haven't been able to enact true conservatism. And the reason for that is that there are so many sort of global institutions that are stopping us from doing it. And they present these as, and you've probably heard these sort of talking points for a long time now, as elitist, out of touch, undemocratic. How do you, the man on the street, influence what a person at Davos says, what a person at the IMF says? How do you influence the civil service? You don't vote in civil servants. So therefore, should we really listen to them, is their point.
Rob, are you suggesting that people have had enough of experts?
Well, I'm not suggesting it.
No. But like, that's what I'm saying. Like that was Michael Gove's famous quote. Given we'd already mentioned him earlier in this episode, just on this point, it's like I can kind of understand what was being said. Like, you know, the way the media reports a lot of it. You know, people be like, "Oh, well, I was told not to eat eggs. Now I'm being told you can eat eggs. They're good for you." That's the kind of stuff the average person complains about. You know, and it's like so, and that got boiled down into Michael Gove's kind of, "Oh, people have had enough of experts." But you know, there are reasons experts exist, and sometimes they get things wrong, but they're having a good guess at stuff, and then they're meant to advise into the elected officials. So just kind of railing against like, oh, well, we had a stupid idea. I mean, I could be nicer, but Liz Truss was like, I have a stupid idea for the economy. All the economists said it won't work. She tried it. It didn't work. Like, I feel that was pretty clear cut, and we're still dealing with the, you know, the repercussions of that now. I feel maybe we should listen to a few more experts right now.
Precisely. Like, I do find that this is the way that conservatism seems to be moving, and it's a concern for me, and you can see it elsewhere in the world as well. But the conservative argument is kind of, let's refer it back to Brexit, which is the big one, which might be which might epitomise this issue in its fullest, I think, for me. Part of the issue about Brexit was that you have the European Union, which they don't like, which they see as taking powers away from the UK, as having institutions there that it's hard for the average person on the street to influence. Yes, we had MEPs, but people seem to think that MEPs had a rather limited function when it came to larger European politics. So the country was sold a solution, which was get out of the European Union, we'll have a lot more freedom, right? We'll be able to do what we did. We're out now. And although the impact of Brexit has been discussed for the past 8 years or so, 8 years since we had the vote, 4 years since we've been out of the European Union officially, not a lot of people see it as a success, or the things that were promised haven't been delivered on. So the Conservatives essentially put forward a promise of, look, you just need to get rid of this institution and that'll free us up. And we did, and it didn't happen. So you're then left with two possible answers, right? Which is, one, the EU actually wasn't the person in charge of this at all. You know, like it was overblown, their influence, and this is just how things are. Or two, this approach the popular Conservatives are taking, where it's like, even if we get rid of the EU, that's enough. We are so close to true freedom, but we just need to go that little bit further, and that involves pulling out of CO2, not listening to Davos, getting rid of all quangos, ignoring universities. I mean, that's where it starts to fall apart, because you need universities and a civil service to maintain government and keep going. But instead of seeing opportunity there, they just see them as roadblocks to their progress. Where they see roadblocks, I see important checks and balances on power. So, for example, you always have to think of this when you talk about anything politically wise. If you're there and you're saying, oh, I would really love it if we got rid of X, then Labour could do so much more, right? It'd be really good if we didn't have to listen to the court system on this, or it'd be really good if we didn't have to listen to the IMF on this, because the IMF are a capitalist organisation who are stopping Labour from doing true socialism, right? I can see that being a big left-wing talking point. Instead, now, you've got the Conservatives saying, oh, don't listen to the IMF because they don't want us to cut taxes. And you're going, sorry, what? The socialist IMF? That doesn't make any sense. The IMF and these things are like a check and balance. They are meant to make sure that the economy keeps going, or is at least safe and stable. They have a vested interest in that, of course, but so does the rest of the UK. So if anybody is there saying that they want to get rid of checks and balances, just imagine if the opposition was in charge and they had no checks and balances and they could do whatever you want. You need these institutions, in my opinion, to make sure that things keep functioning in a relatively sane way and to stop any potentially totalitarian type of person getting in and having too much power. Because, in my opinion, although when you give one person a lot of power, they can get things done quickly and radically, and I think that's what Conservatives want on a lot of these things. Also, what happens is, of course, they have no control over how fast and how far they go, and that can lead to some very dire consequences. So, yeah, I think that's what they're getting at the moment, the Conservatives, and that's these popular Conservatives. I mean, and that's my worry about how far they're taking it.
Yeah, and I think we've seen with stuff where we've discussed with Trump and other stuff over the course of this podcast that, like, there are reasons we have these checks and balances in place, because, like, the number of things where people are like, oh, it would just be so easy if we did X, and I would say on balance it's not. Like that's the, you know, like you say with Brexit, that's a big example. Like, oh, if we just get rid of this, then everything will be better. Oh, well, it wasn't, so we'll just get rid of it. And it's like, well, if we get rid of everything, then what have we got left? We're just, you know, having to do, you know, be at your beck and call people like Rees-Mogg who feel like that they're above the common man, you know, like,
yeah, you don't. We got rid of the EU, but now we've got to get rid of the membership of, like, European Court, and
we should get rid of judges, you know, that kind of stuff.
If we get rid of judges, get rid of human rights.
Yeah,
like those are important things that are meant to enshrine your basic human rights. I think that it's bad, like, controversially, that we'd want to get rid of those type of things just to make sure that we can, I don't know, advance things faster for a Conservative agenda. That does seem dangerous to me.
Yeah. So, like, how much is this, you know, all hot air? Like, these are, you know, we listed at the start how popular they are. Liz Truss on 10%, Lee Anderson 11%, Rees-Mogg surprisingly 19%. Like, I guess because he's not done anything particularly stupid. Like, he gets up there and sounds kind of official, even though I would say it's an easy enough act to see through most of the time, because you can often prove him wrong within about 2 sentences. But fine, I can kind of see why maybe someone might be like, oh, he seems like an upstanding gentleman, you know, who wears a top hat. Fine. But, like, these are not the most popular members of the Conservative Party, as we've already discussed. Does this matter? Well, you know, how much is this just a headline for a week and then it's gone?
Yeah, so I don't think it matters for the grand scheme of, like, it doesn't matter now, but it could matter for the future, right? So it does show maybe a general trend of where Conservative politicians are going, or where they think they might have to go after the last election. It is not a, you know, it's not a secret that a lot of Conservative MPs and that the opinion polls are pointing in one direction, and that's a Labour victory. And it's very unlikely that Rishi Sunak will be able to deliver another Conservative term. So once Sunak is out of the picture, who takes up the reins, right? Who is going to lead the Conservative Party? And Liz Truss might see herself as a potential leader, despite her time as Prime Minister being, you know, unquestionably bad, I would say. Nobody's the shortest reign of a Prime Minister. It is hard to take any successes out of that. I think she would also find that she'd want another bite of the cherry, and we can kind of see mirrored in American politics. You know, Trump may have achieved little in office, but he still thinks he's entitled to a second shot at that. Just give me power. Just give me power one more time, and I'll get rid of the people who stopped me doing the things I really wanted to do, and then you'll see how powerful I can be. That's kind of the sales pitch she's going for. It also shows more of like the talking points here are ones that we've seen before, but on places like Talk TV, on GB News, these are where popular Conservatives would see themselves. So it tends to this more culture war based politics, which has proved to be quite effective in the US, at least in the short term. So what it's very effective at is that it can carve out a clear identity. So if you compare these politics to the politics of David Cameron, a lot of Conservative MPs might have suggested they went too far to the centre ground there, that they lost some of their identity trying to take in a few centre policies, and that alienated those on the right. And slowly but surely, you've seen a drift of those on the right of the party away to other sources, UKIP and now Reform. So They're saying, oh, this is actually, we can say which way the wind's blowing. That's where we want to be. That's how we think that we get a strong base. And it's all about the base, a vocal, energized base for getting people excited, talking about it on Twitter, conversations in the news, essentially making sure you have an argument with somebody and it's a bit divisive. These are kind of the politics of division all over again. The reason we are talking about this, in a sense, is because what they said is so divisive a lot, but it is very divisive. The sort of talking points they are putting across, and it gets views on it. It's that kind of YouTube mentality, clickbait. Let's put something controversial in the title. People are more likely to watch it and engage rather than if you put something sensible on there. I'm sorry, I wish it wasn't that way, but that appears to be human nature, and that is sort of like why they matter, because it shows the Conservatives, at least in this country, are starting to twig onto that. You could see elements of it under Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson, but this group of Conservatives seem to want to go even further with that premise. So that's the sort of argument for yes, they do matter. On the no side, I think the risk you've got is, and what we've talked about since the start, since we laughed at the name, is how popular are they really? They might have an energized base, but how big is that base? Is it 10%? Is it 20% of the public? Is it 15%? That doesn't sound like enough to me to get an electoral coalition going, right? So although your supporters might be the ones to shout the loudest on Twitter, by being so divisive, you also get a lot of detractors. And if your detractors outweigh the people who support you, then it's not a path to government. So they don't matter in that sense. The other reason that I think this sort of fails more, if we're comparing about like the culture war talking points and the differences between the UK and the US, the Conservatives, as I've said, have been in power for 12 years in this country. The arguments that they are giving is, we could have done it, but we were stopped by these institutions. And it's very easy for somebody with a bit of a common sense approach on the street to go, well, you could have done something about those institutions at any point. You could have reduced the size of the civil service massively. You could have abolished quangos if you really wanted to. You could have put legislation out there for universities against LGBT issues if you felt that it was such a big concern that you had to do that. But they didn't, right? They didn't. So the whole fact of them going, oh no, my hands are tied, they didn't. They had all the hard power all along, and they could have, but they didn't. Liz Truss didn't while she was in charge. Or when she tried to, as you've said, like the ultimate proof of this stuff failing, she tried to ignore economic forecasts, experts, when it came to her economic policy, and the country and the economy suffered as a result. And that was one of the things that ultimately led her to be forced out as leader of the country. So that's where they, really don't matter. And the other big question mark, the ghost at the feast here at this event was the appearance of Nigel Farage, who was there watching on. And you can say what you like about Nigel Farage, but he is a very good commentator, and I think he's quite politically astute when it comes to these things. And when he was asked by a journalist what he thought of that, he said, oh, the only message I've got from this is you should vote Reform UK, because we're saying all of these talking points as well, but we can make a real difference. You don't want to be tied to the old Conservatives. And ultimately, that's the thing that these Conservatives are worried about. They're worried about a leak to Reform UK. You've seen it in internal polling, and you might see it in some sort of the models that they're presenting about the big worry for Conservatives, and the reason they might get wiped out at the next general election is because they will lose 10%, 15% of the vote to Reform UK, and 20% of people then go and vote Conservative. That 35% block that they had of vaguely right-wing people, it gets split up into two groups. They can't compete in the first past the post system. They get wiped out. And what Nigel Farage is hoping for in that situation is that Reform UK come along and become the next established right-wing party. That's what PopCon is trying to avoid. They're trying to tie it to the Conservative Party. But with these people as the figurehead, Liz Truss as a figurehead, I don't see it happening. So that's why I don't think at the moment PopCon is a particularly effective organisation for the Conservatives, at least.
Yeah, I think there's a level of, it's not clinging to power because Liz Truss doesn't really have any power right now, right? But there are people that, I mean, Lee Anderson, I think, if I recall, his seat's very likely at risk. I don't know about Liz Truss's seat specifically because I think she might be in one of those seats where the people weirdly like her despite her being useless. But overall, as we're saying, her popularity is quite low. I don't think she can make some noise from the sideline, but the headlines about her tend to be kind of dismissive because of what she did when she was in power. And then I think, well, as I know we've discussed, the hope that Rees-Mogg may go away in a general election as well. So I think there's a bit of like trying to maybe line themselves up for something when they're no longer MPs, make some bluster, then they can, get a speaking job on GB News or something like that. Actually, doesn't Rees-Mogg already have a show on GB News?
He's more GB News than he is MP at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's kind of a trying to line themselves up for something when they're out of power, and that's part of it. Doesn't mean, I don't think in like 10 years or whatever, well, even in a worst case for Labour, so Labour wins this election and then has a really awful time of it for 5 years. Like, I definitely think it's worth keeping an eye on because these are the kind of things that may come back next time round when the Conservatives are going for power. But I think right now we can kind of ignore it, would be my view. So on to our next kind of main story, and this is done the rounds of headline. I'm just going to say before we go into this, put a content warning out there for some transphobia, and also a brief mention of murder. So I'll just say that up front. But we're going to talk about Rishi Sunak and the PMQs. And I think you'd be hard pressed to have missed this story last week. It's definitely kind of gone outside the usual, it wasn't just on political stories. It was obviously discussed pretty much all over the news. So what happened?
Yeah, so this was a story that came out of Prime Minister's questions. Usually, as I say, I'm usually the one telling you about what's gone on in PMQs, and it's quite inside baseball type of stuff, but it is the one opportunity that our Prime Minister gets to speak to not only the House, but the rest of the country and sort of justify himself on a weekly basis. The big talking point of this came on one of Rishi Sunak's responses to Keir Starmer, in which he was making a list of the U-turns made by the current Labour leader. So he said, and I quote, "I think I counted almost 30 in the last year: pensions, planning, peerages, public sector pay, tuition fees, childcare, second referendums." Now, that is where he should have stopped. But he continued and said, defining a woman, although in fairness, it was only 99% of a U-turn. Now, that is in response to Keir's former stance when he was questioned about do women have penises, because for some reason people in this country are obsessed with genitalia that other people may possess. His response was 99.9% of women don't have a penis, trying to separate a difference between gender and sex to a degree. Now,
I think he has struggled with this, as we've touched on before, where he I think I've said it on previous episode. I want him to be, on the right side of this. I want whatever government we have to be on the right side of this. And I get the feeling that Keir is always kind of couching what he says so that they can't call him out in the newspapers as being pro-trans. Like I think he is we've talked about his history as a barrister and everything, and I think he understands that that these people need to be protected and helped, but he won't just get out, and we've said this several times now, he won't just get out and say trans women are women, end of, because he knows he'll get some negative press from it. And that's the kind of thing that will, be in the Daily Mail for weeks. I think that's where he is from what I've been seeing of it. I appreciate, not being a trans person myself, that people are, I've spoken to a lot of trans people who are very disappointed in Keir Starmer for saying those kind of things and never coming out and saying it. And, I've seen people saying, oh, what's the point in picking between the Conservatives and Labour? For people where this is their day to day and they're being treated awfully by transphobic people out in the world, this is not helping because it's not firm enough. That's my reading of it. Is I think he's trying to ensure he doesn't lose any votes over there, despite the fact it looks like Labour's going to win by a silly margin this year. So he could probably stand to come out and say it. And I don't think the polling is that 50% of people hate trans people. I think it's a lot lower than that. So I think he could afford to come out and say it, and he should come out and say it. But yeah, he's done this kind of mealy-mouthed kind of response before.
Yes, he has, and I agree with you there. That quite frankly, he hasn't been strong enough. On this occasion, however, in response to Rishi Sunak, he did show a bit of backbone on it, or at least had a more heightened response to it. So Rishi Sunak said that, and then you can see Keir Starmer from the footage. His left hand, it's gripping a piece of paper, it's shaking. He approaches the box to deliver his speech, and half of the Conservative side of Parliament all go, "Ooh, that touched a nerve, didn't it?" I think the Conservatives were thinking that they touched a nerve over Keir Starmer's U-turns and had ignored the last bit of Rishi Sunak's speech. But it is worth pointing out, before all of this happened, Keir Starmer said that they were joined today by Brianna Gay's mother. Of course, Brianna, who was the victim of a terrible murder done by two absolute monsters of teenagers, one of which, at least one of those teenagers, had very transphobic text messages about Brianna. So you have effectively the mother of a murdered trans woman in Parliament, and then your Prime Minister says what can be considered as a transphobic joke. Not a good look for any Prime Minister. And that's why Keir reacted so angrily about it. Now, personally, I must say, I don't think it matters if you've got the mother of a murdered trans woman there or not. You just shouldn't say the stuff Rishi Sunak said. But given the context that it's probably the worst time to say something like that, that's why it was so shocking that he did it. And he was asked by a Labour MP in a later question to apologise. He refused. At the end of Prime Minister's questions, he did sort of a statement about how much he respected Brianna's mother and talked about the great work that she'd done, because I know that she hasn't mentioned trans issues particularly in her campaign. Afterwards, it's focused on stopping cyberbullying and more protection for children online. So that was what he focused on. But I think it was quite clear for everybody inside and outside the chamber that Rishi Sunak had crossed the line here. He made a big mistake, and he probably needed to apologise for it. Now, what we've had in the following sort of hours and days after that is a refusal from Rishi Sunak to apologise for those comments. I found the apology to be quite disingenuous, because
it wasn't really an apology, was it? They just said,
"Well, no,
sorry,
no, sorry, yeah, no, you're right. It wasn't. You're completely right. It wasn't an apology." Their statement in reaction was, "Oh no, it wasn't a transphobic joke." Why? They don't explain why or not. They have utmost respect for Brianna's mother, but don't go into any more detail about that. They say that actually Labour getting all upset about it is them trying to make a political point out the situation, and that shouldn't happen, because all Rishi Sunak was doing was making a point about how Keir Starmer's rubbish and he's made a load of U-turns, which I might like to point out to Rishi Sunak is a fairly party political point that you are tying directly into the issue of trans rights. So I don't think Rishi Sunak has got a leg to stand on here when it comes to it. And ultimately, I think it didn't just show up. It's a horrible thing to say. Nobody should say it, right? I think we can get that out of the way. Looking at it at a more sort of like the politics of it, it shows a naivety from Rishi Sunak to just sort of follow his script or whatever. I don't know if you've seen Anchorman, but when they say,
yes,
yeah, whatever you put on that teleprompter, Ron Burgundy will say it. Whatever you put on that script, no matter what the situation around there, it appears Rishi Sunak will say it. It didn't take a genius for somebody to, with a little bit of political nous, to go, "Oh, that's who's in. Keir Starmer's addressed who is in the chamber today. Maybe I'll drop that bit from my routine." Okay, so that doesn't become a political talking point. He had, a few days previously, walked into another trap, effectively, when he was on an interview with Piers Morgan, and Piers Morgan offered him £1,000 bet that there wouldn't be any Rwanda flights before the next election. Rishi Sunak shook his hand, no problem. But afterwards, people said, "Look, that's terrible optics when you think about it. You're gambling £1,000 on people's lives. You're a prime minister, one of the richest people in the country. You are £1,000 is quite a lot to a lot of people, and you've just dismissed it as a casual handshake." again, it's naive. It's something that Boris Johnson wouldn't have let himself be fooled by. It's not something Keir Starmer would have let himself be fooled by. And in the space of 3 or 4 days, Rishi Sunak's found like a great political naivety in doing 2 big gaffes. And I think that's a concern going into a general election campaign. What else could he do to sort of trip up in a Conservative sense? And it's been a big problem for the Conservatives. They've had, from what Tory MPs say is going on behind the scenes, they respect Rishi Sunak as a hard worker, as a competent man. I think they see a clear difference between him and Boris Johnson when it comes to the business of running the country behind the scenes. But when it comes to the politics, the speaking, those sort of gestures, what the general public see, he's a lot worse than Boris Johnson ever was at that. And the Conservatives can't seem to find somebody who's good at the 2.
Yeah.
So.
And I think we've touched on this also previously. Like he keeps sticking to these things, and we talked about why a bit in a previous episode. Like he seems to keep talking about how devoted he is to this Rwanda plan that's like falling apart around it. Things like this, and it's like almost a level of stubbornness that doesn't make any sense in face of the facts, which I think we've kind of discussed a bit with Liz Truss and other people. It's maybe not as immediately egregiously bad for the country, but it's still a trait where it's like, I don't know if he sees, he doesn't come across as a strong man, right? Like he kind of like his whole persona was always like, he's a bit, he tries to sell himself as a bit nerdy. He doesn't sell himself as the common man, but he tries to sell himself as a bit nerdy, good with figures, and gets the job done. Like you were saying, some people are like, oh, he's a hard worker, he'll get things done, but not in the Boris Johnson, I will get things done because I said it out loud kind of way. But then it's weird that he just keeps pressing on with these things. And like people know that U-turns are bad, but like, and that happened a lot under Boris's government. But yeah, I just kind of don't know what he's trying to achieve with any of this. And I guess that's because the signaling is not aimed at me, right? He's trying to, he's trying to do the anti-woke stuff, the other kind of conservative stuff that's a bit culture war-y, but not as culture. Well, I mean, it's hard to say not as culture war as other things. There is a culture war around trans people at the moment, and that's awful. But yeah, you just got looking from the outside. It's like, what are you doing over and over again? And yeah, like I would say it makes him look like a weak leader because he's not able to like do the kind of like, it feels like at some point he should have been able to say, look, we're going to cut Rwanda. We'll take our hit here and not keep going on about it. But no, they're just going to keep pressing on with it. And they're probably not going to achieve anything before the general election, I would guess. Not anything of real substance with it.
No, it's almost like he has to play to the anti-woke crowd, but won't go all like, but won't. He's not going as far as what Liz Truss, Lee Anderson, and Jacob Rees-Mogg were suggesting in those PopCons, is he? He has to play to that crowd and pray that they don't vote reform. But it appears all those people have already made up their mind about Rishi Sunak and have gone that way anyway. So if I was him, I thought the political move would be trying to move towards the centre in a way and claim that bit of the party as his own without playing up to that side. But he's tried to play both sides, which is why he can't say sorry, right? I think if he had more power within his own party, he would have just put his hands up and said, yep, I'm very sorry. I shouldn't have said that. It was inappropriate of me to do so. I would like for him to go far and, say more and say some pro-trans rights stuff as well. I don't think he would go that far, unfortunately, but the least he can do in my mind is an apology. Brianna's mother didn't ask for a direct apology, but Brianna's father did, and the Conservative MP's response to that was, yeah, sorry, mate, but you're not going to get one. So if that's their response, even when asked directly by one of the parents in this terrible situation, I don't see how it's good optics for Rishi Sunak or anybody within the Conservative Party. So yeah, bizarre. The only other little point I wanted to mention, because I saw it happening live, so I went, oh my goodness, that's going to blow up as a story, and I quickly went on some websites just to see who was talking about it. Like, big thing on the BBC of course is going to do it. They present the news as it happens. Rishi Sunak said that it was a big talking point. They said it. Guardian brought it up. I had a look on the Express and the Daily Mail websites. They just didn't mention it at all. It was like a black hole of happened at PMQs. We don't cover PMQs. Oh, we what's that? I don't understand. Moving on. It was kind of bizarre, which I think, to me, the fact that they didn't even mention it showed to me how badly he'd messed up. Even when you have papers, institutions who have in my opinion, very anti-trans views and have been going for a while, when even they won't repeat what Rishi Sunak has said or report it on their live feeds or anywhere on their newspapers. I think that goes to show just how wrong they thought it was, or at least how optically bad it was. So, yeah, naivety from Rishi Sunak. Terrible thing he said. He should apologise. Yeah, not going to win himself any friends with that.
So on the opposite side, I just had a bit of a spiel there. I was like, I feel Starmer should come out and take a harder stance on this kind of thing, the kind of thing we want to see from a Labour leader. And I've spoken to multiple people who've said that. It's not just me thinking this. He did stand up in the moment there and was rightly angry about what was said. But he is, as I said, he kind of couches a lot of what he says. And I think there's a concern, and maybe you're going to touch on this as we go into this topic. I don't think Labour can believe they've got this lead, because it's been so long since they've been in power and stuff like that. So that's part of the reason they're being very cautious with stuff. But I guess at this point, when we haven't had a general election announced and we don't have a proper manifesto yet, we've talked a bit about pledges from Labour, but not wanting to paraphrase Hamilton too much, but Keir Starmer, what do you stand for?
Yeah, precisely. I didn't see the Hamilton reference, but you're right. Yeah, what's the thing from Hamilton? If you stand for nothing, what will you fall for, or something?
Something like that. Yeah. Off the top of my head right now, I'm sure I'll get it wrong, and some Hamilton fans will be annoyed at me. But just know I like Hamilton, and that's why I spotted it.
Yeah. So yes. To bring about So when Rishi Sunak was saying all those things and his terrible bit at the end, the bit he was saying before then was about Keir Starmer's U-turns, and I noticed sort of a pattern within this Prime Minister's questions as well, that a consistent line of attack for Conservative governments, and it has been since Boris Johnson. Liz Truss used it in her short time in office, and Rishi Sunak keeps using it, and it's probably their most effective line, is that basically Labour don't have any policies. What do Labour stand for? Nobody knows. And the most effective political lines people use are ones that are exaggerated but have a grain of truth in them, right? And I think even as me, somebody who feels that they follow politics quite well, if you ask me to sort of sum up Keir Starmer's main 5 policies or give me a big one, I would really struggle. And one thing that maybe some people could have mentioned was Labour's policy on green energy and their want to sort of expand green energy policies. Now, this one was costed by the Treasury, which they are allowed to do. You are allowed to, as a government, use the Treasury to cost opposition policies if you want to make sure how feasible they are. The Treasury came up and they said, we reckon these green energy pledges are going to take about 28 billion. Now, that's a big number, obviously, and it's a big number that sounds scary, and you can attack Labour on it, particularly when the Conservatives feel that they've made some ground attacking green issues. We talked about how they won the by-election in Boris Johnson's constituency on the sort of emission zone that Sadiq Khan was extending, and the ULEZ scheme that they had there. So they see some potential in this line of attack. They also attack Keir Starmer on taxes. I know that the Conservatives are not the ones to really attack on taxation, as we're at the highest levels post-war that we've ever been at, and it's been a criticism within the Conservative parties that taxes are too high and that the government is unwilling or unable to lower them. But their line of attack to Labour is, well, if you think we're bad at raising taxes, just imagine how bad they'll be at it. And how are you going to fund all of these? It's all going to come out of you, the public pocket. Yeah, sorry, a little bit of that. So, yes, out of the public pocket. So on Thursday, it was sort of leaked by the BBC, and in the end, it was announced that Labour were pulling back some of their green pledges. Now, the reason Keir Starmer gave for this, he's basically said, we would have spent £28 million, but when we made this policy, the economy was a lot better. The Conservatives have messed the economy up so much that we can't afford £28 billion anymore. We would like to spend that one day, but we're going to have to spend a little less and redo our sums, which got, again, it's another U-turn for the list that Rishi Sunak can mention in the next PMQs, but it also had a bit of dismay amongst those within Labour themselves. And I saw former environmental secretaries and some people from the left of the party, particularly like Momentum, if you remember them, they were the group that sort of brought Corbyn to power. They're the ones criticising Keir Starmer and say, look, you had a policy and now you've gotten rid of it. Why? So trying to look into this and, what Labour stand for, why they're playing it too safe. Essentially, for me, the reason that Keir Starmer is doing this is that he saw what happened before him with Jeremy Corbyn. And it's been a while since I've talked about him, but it is interesting to compare the two leaders, right? So Corbyn definitely stood for something, right? I think, and that's one of the reasons he was so successful at invigorating grassroots politics. We've talked about, the grassroots politics of the right and what they get excited about. Corbyn excited the left. He got a lot of people voting, a lot of people excited about Labour that had never been excited before. That worked well in 2017 with the Theresa May election, where you've got Corbyn, who stands for something different, something bold. Theresa May, what does she stand for? Oh, maybe nothing. A bit of more of the same under the Conservatives. That was enough to dramatically reduce her huge lead and bring it into a hung parliament, right? However, in 2019, people knew what Corbyn stood for, and it appeared the general public didn't much care for it. So they rejected that policy at the 2019 election and led to the Conservatives winning by 70 seats. So Labour don't want to lose their poll lead. They don't want to stand for the same things Jeremy Corbyn did because they saw how effective those attack lines were against them, and they're worried about that happening again. But I do think they need to stand for much more than, not just the Conservatives, right? A lot of what Keir Starmer is proposing is just kind of like, we'll kind of do what the Conservatives do, but we'll be better at it and a bit more caring. Trust us. But that runs the risk of maybe upsetting those within his own party and not enthusing the voters enough.
I think there's one thing, as we said, Labour, big poll lead. We'll look at the polls in a minute. And I agree, they need to stand for not being the Conservatives, but I can see there's a kind of pragmatism they're trying to go for, or at least I think there's a pragmatism they're trying to go for where they're like, well, if we're just not the Conservatives, we can get in power and then we can do things. But obviously, as we've discussed before, if you don't have stuff in a manifesto, then not even all manifesto pledges get done by a government. So if stuff's like, if we're unsure right now what you're going to do, it's kind of like, oh, I guess you're less worse than those guys. Good. Interesting looking at the Labour policies, their missions that they have on their website. So it's not a manifesto, but it's kind of a set of intentions, right? The first thing I said, okay, there's a small paragraph and you can download this document. But the first thing I say is strong, stable and secure foundations. And I don't think those are bad words, but I do think it's a bad idea to use strong and stable in a sentence in UK politics when it was only 5 years ago that Theresa May was saying the same thing. Do we want to just go down to these 5 things then and go through them?
Yeah, you can. I mean, within that strong and stable, look at the thing: economic stability, strong national defence, secure borders. If I hadn't told you that was Labour, you might be thinking that's a Conservative manifesto.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
To prioritise those 3 things.
I mean, I think the first one makes sense given what we've discussed already with Liz Truss and everything. Currently, I don't think many people have faith in the Conservatives to be the economically stable ones that they've always claimed to be. So I can see why you want to get that out there and be like, Labour are going to do this financially sound. And with relation to the point we've just had about the £28 billion pledge, that's kind of what they're trying to say. Actually, well, maybe we can't afford this, and so we're going to roll back on it. But the problem is then what are you putting forward? Yeah, I think those 3, they could just be, I mean, they're just things most people want. To a level. I mean, secure borders, we can get into the whole the way they talk about it. When you actually read the paragraph, it's more Labour. It's like, the Conservatives have messed this up. We want to do this to fix this. We want to cost save here and all this kind of stuff, which all is very sensible. But the headline is maybe more aimed at your Conservative voters who are thinking of switching sides. And then we've got our 5 missions. So do we want to go through these one at a time?
Yeah, go for it.
So these are 5 fully funded national missions, which is the whole thing about the 28 billion. We're going to have the money for these. So number 1 is get Britain building again.
Which is, that's a claim that governments have been making for the last 15 years. Like, we've got to build more houses, we've got to build more for Great British Energy, which is the green side of things. But Labour have always said that they reckon they can boost the economy by having green projects that will have a longer tail. So, a bit like FDR's New Deal, where you build public infrastructure projects now to give people jobs, and down the line people benefit from that. It's meant to be an overall economic positive. I think that's the policies there. And of course, like, more homes to try and tackle the homing crisis. So that seems relatively sensible.
Again, sensible, but not like some bold, interesting policy to put your mask to. It's just like you say, people have been saying it over and over. That it's not education, is it? Which itself was a fairly simple pledge, but it was catchy.
Yeah.
So number 2, switch on Great British Energy, which is a slightly weird way of titling it, but this is the idea of having a publicly owned power generation company, so like EDF in France, which I think that's a good idea given the problems we have with the current system where we've seen these companies making massive record profits off people during a cost of living crisis.
Yeah, I think that this is like the closest Labour get to like a big policy pledge. Like, you're looking for something that can go in the manifesto and people will remember. I said earlier, like, I can't think of many policies that Labour have done. This is the one that I've got in my head. This nationalisation, a national energy company, to nationalise one energy body, like you say, like EDF. So it is owned by the government, but you can see them like turning a lot of profit, making a lot of money, it being sensible that they are in control of that. If we have, things like that they've talked about, so we're not dependent on the actions of dictators like Putin. You could see how much gas prices fluctuated and how the government had to sort of jump through hoops to try and control that or bring the prices down, or okay, we don't actually tax the energy companies, but we subsidize the people. If it was owned by the government, or at least part of it was owned, then they would have far more power to just tell Great British Energy to lower the gas prices or keep them the same so people can get heating on. So I can see this as a big, good policy pledge. I would say this is my one gold star for Keir Starmer so far. Well done. That's a policy I can tell people on the doorstep and you can relate to if you want to. So, yeah. So next one, if you want to go with that.
Yeah, next one is get the NHS back on its feet, which I think, again, is one that people often say, but I think is particularly pertinent right now. When you compare it to a government that's been dragging out, strikes from junior doctors and other people, nurses, etc. It feels like, if you can say, look, we're going to do things to fix that, you're going to get a lot of people on side. I mean, I always forget the statistic, but there's a statistic of like number of people who know someone who works in the NHS, basically, and it's like most of the country because the NHS is huge.
Yes, and it's, again, I think this is a good policy, but sometimes I look at these things, it's like, who doesn't want the NHS to get back on its feet? Are you just saying the obvious? The big thing there they've got is their top bullet point, cut waiting times. Well, that's literally one of Sunak's pledges, right? So these are good pledges to have, but how different are they from a Conservative government? They've said that they will pay more for doctors and nurses, paid for by ending non-dom tax breaks for the very wealthy. So again, that suggests it's not going to be a tax. Well, they're going to stop tax breaks on the very wealthiest in order to pay that. So that's one mark, I guess, in the sort of socialism left wing. This is what we would do differently from the Conservatives column. But that's kind of it. We'll fund the NHS through taxes on the wealthy. I think you've got to try and get that into a manifesto and clarify what that is. It's not, for me, as eye-catching as the Great British Energy one.
Yeah, I think there are some other points in here which are good, like end the ATM scramble for GP appointments. I mean, I know that's a thing that I've had issues with before. It's like you just have to like ring at this time, and there are GPs who have online systems, so you could, if you had a unified system or if you had like a software package you could roll out that supported that, or some kind of booking system. Like, again, there are implementation details, but you can see how that's a kind of relatively easy win in the grand scheme of the NHS, is to spend a bit of money on something like that people would immediately, like, if you realize you could book, because the problem with the current system is you have to ring for that day. But like, if I could book an appointment in a week, I don't have urgent things to discuss with a GP right now. I'm a younger person who doesn't have any chronic issues. I could say, hey, in a week, I'd like to talk about this thing, please, for half an hour with a GP, because I'm slightly worried about it. But it's not, it's not so pressing that I'd have to go to hospital, and it's not like so pressing I need to be seen today. And like when we were younger, you would turn up to your GP for kind of like routine checkups and stuff like that. Like it doesn't fit in as well anymore. So I think that one, while it's kind of below the headline, is actually probably quite a prudent and sensible one, where I think people would suddenly notice if you suddenly went, oh, I don't have to have this hassle. That's an easy win, as people like to say. And then the other one, care in the community. I think that was a thing that got cut a lot of times under the Conservatives. Like the idea that, like, again, if you handle it right, you can get people back out of hospitals sooner, which allows you to cut down those waiting lists. Because if people are waiting on the beds because there's not the support in the community for them to, waiting in beds, because there's not the support in the community for them when they get out, then you get people staying in hospital longer than they need to. So that means you then get a backlog. So that's another thing where, if done properly and sensibly, you can see it being a fairly easy win and help with the other things as well. But yeah, it's not a jump out loud policy right now. It's like, I'm sure people in the NHS will be happy to get more money and all of that, and that will fix some of the current problems. But it's not like instantly obviously a super Labour policy. Speaking of things that aren't instantly obviously a super Labour policy, take back our streets. I mean, that sounds straight out of Conservative HQ, doesn't it? As a turn of phrase.
Yes, it does. And they've got things like more policemen, 13,000 more neighbourhood police, half violence against women and girls, and tougher sentences for rapists, which I think is like, who's going to say no to that? That sounds like more red meat. That sounds like a talking point that you'd have in like the Sun newspaper. That sounds like something you can throw to the tabloids and say, look, we're being super tough on crime, and introduce new respect orders, a tough new order with criminal sanctions for antisocial behaviour. Kind of sound like they've rebranded ASBOs. Yeah, there. But if you're sort of talking about this is something that Labour governments, when they get into power, tend to do or tend to influence. Somebody who was very hard on crime, Tony Blair, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. That's what he said. So it was a two-pronged attack. This just seems to be, we're going to be tough on crime, full stop. They kind of, Labour feel a need to overcompensate, I feel sometimes, because people feel that they are going to be weaker on law and order than a Conservative government, just because for some reason, ideologically, you feel that, the Conservatives would, be really, really tough. Labour say, no, look, we'll be tough. Actually, we'll be tougher. We'll double the sentences for rapists, etc., etc. So, yeah, I can see this as a good point for Labour. But then again, if you want to distinguish it from the Conservatives, if you ask Rishi Sunak if he would try and make tougher sentences for rapists the next day, maybe he probably would try to make that happen. Because why wouldn't he? So, yeah.
Again, trying to sift through the points here. The first bullet point is put 13,000 more neighbourhood police and PCSOs on our streets. And one of the problems we've been having is that the police were underfunded as part of austerity measures, and so we have less police. And like, I know there are systemic problems with the police, etc. But like, if you have neighbourhood police officers who know their area and aren't just like dropped in when there's a problem, that has been shown to like reduce crime in areas and help with things. So I think, if they're saying they're going to pay for it by cutting outside contractors and waste, that's going to be all fully costed and funded up as they've told us. But if that is correct, they can fix these things and then pay for more police officers. That should help with some of those things they're talking about. And actually, and that again feels a bit more Labour, like the idea that we have more stuff going into the community and more, it's the whole Conservative Labour divide, right? Like Conservatives, like, we want absolutely minimum interference from government, whereas Labour are like, actually, if you have this, and this support mechanism in place, yes, it costs more money, but in the long run, things fix themselves and sort themselves out more.
Yes, I think I agree with that. But within that statement, there's no sort of, when Tony Blair said tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, he was very specific that second part, causes of crime, was about, help before people became criminals, right?
Yes.
Stopping them, you have a social safety net there. I'm reading these 4 points now so far that we've had. I would say that one of the biggest things people are calling for, or one of the things that was like a big Corbyn talking point, for example, one of the reasons that they liked him was that we had austerity for a number of years. Public services are being cut back. A lot of people want to see more investment in their local public services to get back to a level like it was before austerity, because they can see the impact it's having on their wider community. Of these 4 points so far, I'm not seeing a great commitment to more social services type of thing, more public works. And if we get onto the last point, which is break down barriers for opportunity, I can't see anything else in there either. Labour are talking about expanding apprenticeships. They're talking about sort of breakfast clubs in primary schools. They're talking about more teachers in classrooms. And I agree with Labour here that education is, I think, one of the big weaknesses, or one of the things that the Conservatives really struggled with. Underfunding of schools. We talked briefly about RAC on this podcast as well, which I think is a symbol of how schools struggle with finance, and the Conservatives haven't really looked forward on those type of things to help protect people in schools. It's a very big issue for most voters. If they've got children, if they've got a child in schools, of course you want your child to get the best education possible. So I think these points are good for Labour. They just need to go a bit stronger on them. I don't know what your opinion is just on that last point before I launch into like my conclusion.
Yeah, and I mean, again, that probably sounds, while the switch on Great British Energy point is like, a national energy company is very Labour in feel. Breakdown barriers to opportunity is, I'm sure the Conservatives have said some kind of point along those lines before, but it does feel more Labour as a general point. I would agree that, like, in that, I mean, recruiting more staff and stuff like that is obviously going to be helpful to improve teaching. But like that one is definitely a lot less clear in immediately how that's going to help things. And it is like, the idea of having breakfast clubs and stuff like that. Like, I can see why that'd be a positive. It is kind of a social good thing. But yeah, it's a bit muddier, isn't it? Okay, so what's your take after 5 kind of varied points from their not manifesto?
So my take is that I think Labour should be, although these approaches are good, and do I think they would do things better than Conservatives at the moment? Yes. I don't think it would be hard, given what's going on at the moment. There's not much sort of substance here to suggest what they're going to do, how far, how fast. And as I mentioned before, one of the biggest problems I think people have is a lack of investment in public services. This manifesto, sorry, it's not a manifesto, these mission statements don't go far enough in that. And I think the reason behind it is based on money. All of the pledges to put more stuff into public services would take money. And how do you raise money? Well, you've got to boost the economy, or you increase taxes, preferably like maybe both. If you do both, then you'll get even more money. Keir Starmer, with this sort of him getting the jitters over this figure of 28 billion, to me is worrying, because if he wants to fund what people actually want, he will have to spend some money, and that money will have to come from somewhere, and he's going to have to accept that he will get attacked by Conservatives for wanting to raise the money. It's what they do, right? It's just the Conservatives will always have a go at Labour for being high tax, because that's usually one of the ways that you get your economy moving. Now, obviously, the Conservative talking point is if you get lower taxes, then that boosts business, which helps the economy grow quicker. What Liz Truss's big argument was. However, it appears that at the moment, at least in our current economy, that won't work, and that it worked in our detriment. And you've got people like the IMF saying, hey, you can't lower taxes at the moment. He's saying they're saying that to Rishi Sunak now, and he's meant to be the sensible one of the economy. So I think Labour have to accept, to an extent, that they will have to raise taxes, they will have to justify that to the public, and they have to be strong enough and confident enough in that argument if they want to deliver on sort of like real change, real pledges, what people really want, which is money back in public services. And I am worried that Keir Starmer doesn't seem like he's confident enough in that yet. I feel like he just wants to get in power, then he might have a go at raising taxes. But I think that would be disingenuous as well. I would rather he be honest with the public from the start. And there's lots of ways you can raise taxes and say it's a boom. For example, in that NHS back on its feet, how are we going to pay for more money for nurses and doctors? We'll tax non-dom wealthy people, not a popular group amongst the general public. It won't affect a lot of people. that sounds like a good tax, or one of the more like acceptable taxes. He could go after Amazon or something. It's been done in the past. Like, hey, we're going to tax mega corporations and make sure that we're getting their share of the money. We're going to tax energy companies more to make sure that those people who are making massive profits and aren't reinvesting it, we'll take a tax off them and we'll invest it in national government schemes for green energy to make sure we're more sustainable into the future. Like, I don't want to write Labour's policy for them, and I can't do the sums, but it seems like they have some easy wins here, but Keir Starmer doesn't seem to want to commit to them. I don't know why. Maybe the sums don't add up in the background. Maybe they're not confident enough yet. Maybe they're a little bit nervy about how green policies are sort of something that gets Conservative voters riled up enough that they would lose a by-election. But at the moment, they seem so scared of standing for anything concrete just because they've got a fear of being attacked. I think he needs to learn how to take it on the chin and put forward some bolder policies. Of course, we might be having a very different conversation when the manifesto is published.
Yeah, I mean, it could be they blow us all away, like to quote Hamilton once more. It could be that they come in with some amazing bombastic policy, and that's why they don't want to lose that momentum in the run-up. Because right now, we've talked about it, the general election is definitely happening, but we don't know exactly when. And so they don't want to be drawn on some issues more specifically, because then the Conservatives go, oh, well, actually, our policy is that too, or something. I can see why, but countering our point we said about Sunak and stuff. Like I said earlier, when I think Keir is because he's a lawyer, right? He can be very precise with his word. I mean, he's obviously messed up. There was some things about Israel and Gaza where he then apologized about something he said. That was, I think we touched on at the time as well. And I'm sure someone can point out many things, but politicians are consistently recorded and stuff. They're bound to split up sometimes. But he is very, I said mealy-mouthed earlier when talking about the trans issues, that he's talking, but I think what he's trying to do is be clever with his words so that what he says sounds to a general member of the public like the thing they believe, but actually and that does feel disingenuous, right? Like, it's like, we want them to stand up there and say, we're standing for all these things that are good for the country. And then everyone goes, yeah, that sounds great, please. And I think we kind of touched on this, and we're going to touch on it again in the polls section. Like, they could win a bigger landslide than Tony Blair, but there doesn't feel like there's that kind of swell of, oh, yeah, Blair isn't. But interestingly, there was an interview, I think, from Newscast with Lord Mandelson. And he was saying at the time, like on the night, they were surprised at how well they did in 97. So I think, they thought they were going to win, and they were kind of going for a certain thing. But it's interesting how, there's things that happen historically. And we were kids, right? Some of the kind of Mandelson's point was that bits of that were things we wrote afterwards when we got there. We went, oh, everyone would, and we saw the result, and everyone went, yeah, but you didn't know that 2 days before necessarily. You were still worried as Labour that you could lose again, because they should have won the election before that, right? That we've discussed that before. They were like, that you think they should have won there, but actually they didn't, and it's like, so they already had that concern. And we've talked about it. Was it Kinnock?
It was Kinnock.
Yeah, so he was overly we're definitely going to win, and that turned some voters off, it seems. And that's quite a historic thing, but also, if you are part of the Labour Party, you're very into those kind of things. You'll remember those things, and it can affect how you're planning stuff. So yeah, I hope for a more interesting manifesto when it comes round. I guess we should head into the polls. So, poll of polls. This hasn't moved much since this could be December, this could be November, this could be, or maybe not October. That was when the Conservatives started to drop again. But it's a pretty similar split. The only difference, I think, now is Reform has come up a bit, and overall Labour and Conservatives have dropped a tiny bit on average. But Labour still in the lead with 44%. Conservatives 20% below at 24%. And then Reform has 11%, which I think in an actual election, you might find more of that goes back to the Conservatives, just because they might not think Reform's going to win in an area. But again, that's just me guessing. Lib Dems on 6%, Greens on 6%. So Lib Dems on 10%, Greens on 6%, SNP on 3%. So yeah, maybe a slight increase there for SNP since the last time we looked at some stuff. But basically the same kind of at the lower levels, except Reform have taken a few more vote, a tiny bit more of the pie, and it's still a massive lead for Labour.
Yes, still massive lead, which again shows that hey, maybe it doesn't matter that they don't stand for anything at the moment, or they have that appearance that people still prefer them over the Conservative government, and that's all that matters. Those reform numbers are the ones that will be concerning the Conservatives the most. Reform were, if you look back, this covers a year, does it? Yeah, it covers a year. A year ago, Reform were around 5%. So they've nearly doubled in a year, which goes to show that enough people have had time to look at Sunak and go, oh no, he's not for me. I'm not going to switch my vote to Labour, but it's enough for me to not vote for the Conservatives, and I would vote Reform as a protest. That's why they're worried. If you get 10% of people voting Reform in every constituency where the Conservatives stand, they're probably taking votes away from Conservatives rather than Labour. If you think back to what we had post-Brexit, where we were talking about the new political landscape and how, oh my goodness, Labour are losing red wall seats because of this Brexit divide. They've become Conservative voters. Those people who voted Brexit and became Conservative voters in that time are still in the Conservative voter pool, but now maybe they've gone more to UKIP or Reform. So if Reform grows, it's not a big detriment to Labour. You know how we used to look at polls with UKIP and go, oh, that's taken away 40% of Labour votes, 60% Conservative, or thinking about it on those lines about how they split the vote. Reform, it's pretty much, I think that's a 1-to-1. You are just stealing people who voted Conservative in the 2019 election. So that's why the Conservatives are so worried about their gain and how that might affect them in a 2024 election. So why Labour can feel quietly confident as well, or at least feel a little bit safer with Reform looking at those sort of numbers. If Reform was suddenly to dip, I think you'd see that 4-5% creep back to the Conservatives rather than to the Labour Party.
And I've gone to our usual general election prediction website as well. So we got those numbers from the end of January. How do they translate, we think, to the general election? So the predicted seats for Conservatives, 126, which would put them about 40 below where they were in 97. That is low. That would be very, very bad night for the Conservatives. I think I would have to go back and listen to previous episodes to see what the numbers were, but that seems possibly lower than it's been before. Labour on 453 as their predicted seats, which would put them about 40 higher than they had in the 97 general election. But yet the predicted majority is still 256, which would only be 3 more than they had in the general election in 97. So it would still put them above Tony Blair, which is, as we say, when it feels like, yeah, the Conservatives are doing badly, but it doesn't feel like Labour are doing amazingly, like they just have a giant lead, as we've just discussed. Then it's kind of interesting to say that the current prediction is better than in 97. In there, the Lib Dems get 30 seats, which would it's not up to Paddy Ashdown levels in 97, but it does restore some of those seats they've had before, despite 10%. Or in fact, this is an interesting, predicted votes for the Lib Dems, 9.8%. Predicted votes for Reform, 10.4%, and that leads to 0 predicted seats for Reform, which shows you how the kind of spread of things works, which is always kind of interesting in the first past the post. They're also predicting SNP will lose 30 seats. So I don't think that would necessarily be a surprise. We talked about SNP and the problems they've had before, but it is interesting that means where Scotland votes has a bigger effect again, like it used to back in the 90s and early 2000s before the SNP essentially took over Scotland. So yeah, it's going to be interesting. Any thoughts on that, Rob?
Yeah.
Bigger than 97?
Bigger than 97 sounds mad. And I think, yeah, it is. I think what you said about Peter Mandelson before is pretty much how we're feeling now, right? Like it doesn't quite feel real. Like the history books will be written after the result and they'll have a look back with hindsight on the years before, and they'll be able to definitively say, oh, this is the moment that Sunak or the Conservatives or Liz Truss or Boris Johnson lost the faith and people started swarming to Labour in their droves or whatever. Or alternatively, this is where Keir Starmer made his one fatal mistake that led to the surprise hung Parliament result of 2024, right? We're not there yet. We can't write histories. I think what's the most interesting thing I can see from this current prediction is like they've got low seat, high seat, right? And the predicted seat lies within the middle. Low seats for Labour, 330, which I think off the top of my head would still be a majority within Parliament if you have 330 seats.
Isn't it like 6? It's 635, isn't it, at the moment? But we are about to change the seats. So I don't know under the new boundaries how many seats we have, because there are slightly more seats now, right? So
there are 650 MPs
okay.
in Parliament. At the moment, this model is saying if Labour perform as badly as we think that they could perform on the night, they still get a majority. Not a huge majority, but a majority.
For reference, in 2017, Theresa May had 317 seats, and that was when she did the supply, what was it, confidence and supply thing with the DUP. And then in the previous government, they had 330 seats, which is exactly what we're discussing. So, yeah, that would have been a majority, a slight majority, but a majority.
Yeah. Whereas the low for the Conservatives, 44,
which is ridiculous.
Like, it doesn't sound real saying it like that. Like anything in just two figures for them seems mad rather than three. So that is how dire things are for the Conservative Party compared to where Labour are. The spread is so much. The amount of mistakes that Labour can make in one or two constituencies, it won't come down to them in the same way, it appears, because they have so much sort of built-in failure that they can have and still get a good result. So yeah, that prediction should, if you are a Labour supporter, make you feel a little bit more comfortable. But yeah, it's a long way to go, and the election hasn't even been announced yet.
Yeah, and well, unless there's suddenly some breaking news, and I've just checked, there hasn't been breaking news. It's a weird place to be as someone who doesn't want the Conservatives in power at the next general election, after the next general election, I guess. Right now, as we've discussed, kind of a varied episode, because it started off with like, oh, look at this kind of silly Conservative stuff, and then you look at Labour and it's like, oh well, where is this going? Like I say, I think it's pretty clear Labour are going to win, but I'd like to know more about what they plan to do with their time in power personally, so that I can maybe look forward to something from a government for a change.
It'd be nice, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Rob, as always, for joining me. For our listeners, you know where to go to find us. You can find us at parliamentary.observer, where you can leave a comment on an episode. You can find us on YouTube, TTSS Productions. We now have YouTube now has a built-in RSS to podcast kind of generator, so I don't have to spend silly amounts of time generating little videos anymore. It just happens automatically, which is great. You can go to Facebook and find us as Unparliamentary Language. You can go to Instagram and Twitter, because I'm still not calling it X, at Unpal Podcast, and you can find us on Reddit /r/Unparliamentary. And of course, if you want to throw $1 or $2 our way, you'll just get access to our kind of bonus chats we have before the episodes, and just to support the podcast in general, you can go to patreon.com/TTSS. And I guess there's nothing left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
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 Bye. Bye. Bye.